Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Nature Seminar, the first of this term. And before I introduce our speaker, I'll just mention some of the seminars we've got in the next few weeks. Next week, there's no seminar. But the week after, we've got Florist Fleischman from the University of Minnesota on restoration social science, understanding how and why people restore landscapes and what the impacts of restoration are on human well-being. So he's a quite prominent social scientist who often has a critical view of global restoration efforts. So that should be a really interesting talk. And then on May the 3rd, we've got Hugh Possingham, who's the Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy. And then the week after, we've got Justin Adams from the Tropical Forest Alliance. So just highlighting some of the few ones we've got, and there's various ones are planned for the rest of that term. And so handing over to today's guests, we've just had a wonderful 2-day workshop under the auspices of the UN Human Development Programme, looking at how we can craft a positive nature of people thriving with nature, creating these positive visions and aspirations for planetary futures. And as well as David, there's a number of contributors, some of them are in the audience here as well, that have really contributed to this quite creative and quite promising process. But turning to David, so David is the current chair of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is the IPCC for biodiversity for those not in the biodiversity space. He studied at Harvard and at the University of Miami, and is the founding director of Cordio, which is an organization which you will hear more about, based in Kenya, which with a focus on coral reefs in East Africa. And he's also a member of the Earth Commission, which I think we'll hear a bit more about. And so thank you, David, for coming to speak to us. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Yadvinder. I hope I can be heard well enough. Just wave if you can't hear me at the back. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming on such a nice Friday afternoon outside, and to the workshop participants who will have heard a little bit of this, but I'll get a bit more background on some of the items here. So yes, as Yadvinder explained, I'm a coral reef ecologist by training, and I'll start with some of that in the background. But with the state of coral reefs, with climate change, and also with dependence by small-scale fishers around tropical regions, been sort of moving into broader sustainability, global sustainability circles to try and push for change, because unfortunately our science hasn't been getting the right sort of change so far. And so I'm coming out of that and working much more in the sort of the policy space, the sustainable development goals there. I'll talk about those a little bit, not just about how they're national or global goals, platforms, and very misunderstood, I think, or very constrained in that understanding of them, but how they really describe life locally in many ecosystems around the world, including over here. And I'll come to that. So I'll go through these three main topics, just some background on nature, economy, and society. So there's coral reef focus that I have in terms of use and climate change, and then trying to identify how we get to actions for a safe and just planet, or for nature and people to thrive together. There's many different ways this can be expressed. People are more comfortable with different types of words and terminology, but the idea is that we are completely dependent on nature, and we need to sustain it in order for it to also sustain us, and of course to try and minimize further loss of species and ecosystems and so on. This work has really come through a lot of collaborations. I've put this acknowledgement here rather than just at the end. It's in my last slide. And then I'm sort of framing some of what I'm talking about now and how I'm approaching this in this article in the New York Times Magazine, which came as something out of left field for me. I've been working in climate change and coral reefs for 25 years. So I've interacted with a lot of reporters and writers talking about it. And so this was a climate change issue for the New York Times, and realizing that, after the 25 and 30 years of work that I've put into trying to get articles published and really high prominence in journals and magazines and in the media and so on. It really came down to just, having a few contacts, a 45-minute interview, which she wrote up, and they have a fantastic photographer who took this article. And that was complicated making it happen. There were 7 of us from around the world involved in this. And then the next thing I knew, the photo was going to be on the cover of the New York Times. And this is at the end of last year. And this is the greatest, the biggest prominence I've had in anything that I've done. And of course, I did very little to really make this specific thing happen. How do we get this communication? How do we move forward? And I think part of the reason that my story came to the fore of this magazine is that, a lot of us deal with climate change and different challenges like that with grief. Climate anxiety and climate grief are very real. We try and teach our students, to be the leaders of the future and so on. But I expressed, and I tried to get into this photo also, this real anger about what was happening, and that part of the reason we're not getting action is because we're not pointing fingers in the right places. And we have to be very direct about that to get people to really understand what needs to change and by whom and for whose benefit and so on. And the more honest we are, though it might be difficult to put out, the further we'll go with getting action. So as I said, I focus on coral reefs, the coastal fisheries as a case study, and really coming out from that world, because reefs are declining so rapidly, and I'll go into that in a little bit. I think there's limited we can do to sort of halt their decline in the next 20 years, given what happens with carbon dioxide and warming. But as a case study of human development challenges, it's a very powerful one, because coral reefs are very understandable. They're very familiar to most people. They're strange enough being in the water that they're a little bit alien and exciting. And of course, they're very colorful, but they're similar enough to terrestrial ecosystems because they're grounded on the seabed and with physical structure that we can relate to, so that people can understand what's happening. And particularly with the Sustainable Development Goals like this, arranging them in a circle around a particular space or a case study. As a coral reef scientist and conservationist, we're focused on goal 14. That's the blue one up there, SDG 14. And we tend to focus on that goal. What's the status of reefs? How do we stop all these things from, coming in from the outside? But I think the real power of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the sustainability paradigm as a whole, is how do we look through the thing that we're interested in to all the other things that are either impacting on our case or else that are supported by our case. So the importance there is in the interlinkages across the goals and how that is expressed in that specific space. And you can talk about all of these goals from the perspective of a local space. And this is a story or an article I did it was a really nice illustrated conservation magazine based in India. And what they did is they commissioned articles, and then they commissioned an artist to do artwork for that story, and fantastic artists. And in this case, what happened with this story is I started with this story of a fisherman and his wife, so a couple who depend on the reef system. She sells fish in the market amongst many other jobs. He catches fish, and then how their life depended on the reef. They start up a protected area in the community and all the relationships. And you can go through all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in very limited number of words, just using normal language to describe their life situation and how they share the benefits from that reef within their family and with other users in the area. So using this framework to really understand what's happening on the ground. Now, in a much more complex framework, so I'm also now the chair of the IPBES platform, and I've been working on IPBES assessment since 2017, I suppose, the first global assessment. I joined that sort of halfway through the process. Sandra Diaz was one of the co-chairs of that assessment. And what I've come through that process was to see, again, the power of scientific assessments and bringing knowledge, bringing science to policy platforms to explain to governments what's important to do, but also to stakeholders. And this latest assessment that is still ongoing now, and I joined it as a co-chair 2 years ago because I realized that this is the sort of thing I want to be writing about and producing sort of as a scientist, reaching out to policymakers and to the public. It was looking at the nexus between 5 sectors, so biodiversity, climate change, food, health, and water. And it's really about the interlinkages between these things that is critical. How do actions from the health sector impact on the others or benefit from actions in the others? And how can we get stakeholders in each of these areas really realize that in planning their actions, the more they think about the synergies and the trade-offs with the others, the more sort of co-benefits or multiple wins that can be achieved from the same investment, just tweaked a little bit differently. Or maybe it costs a little bit more, but not so much more that it's not worth doing it. And of course, then you can share costs. And of course, this really becomes a mini SDG assessment because you can attach each of these elements of the nexus we were dealing with in this report to different goals. And so my interest really then with this assessment, and now that I'm the chair of the platform, I have to come away from the science, but now I have a responsibility to take it forward once it's produced to really get impact from its publication across multiple different nexus types. So not just related to those 5, really focusing on the interactions across all of the goals or the relevant interactions. Once you subset your case to the particular goals you're interested in, you can simplify that diagram and understand the relationships, and then really get people to look at and actors to look at trade-offs, to leverage synergies, and so on. The nexus governance of complex challenges is very important. And then we're also thinking about, of course, we want to promote incremental or transition improvements, but we also really want to promote transformation as well. And that's the subject of a parallel assessment that IPBES is doing. So thinking about coral reefs in this way, communicating about what happens in a reef. And I think it's very useful also to simplify this down to understanding. Now, different people have very different worldviews about nature and the relationship between nature and society and people. But from an IPBES point of view, thinking about the things that we use and how we share them across society, and then the impacts of that use on nature, I sort of try and simplify that down into something, searching for it. This is a trial, see what you all think of this, but thinking of the 3 main parts of the sustainable development paradigm, so nature, economy, and society. And it's really about the bottom layers, the reef system that I have been studying all this time. And then the middle layer is the use and extraction. That's the fishermen there. And then people and well-being, how the reef supports people in those communities. And then seeing the interactions between those buckets, those 3 buckets, really around the indirect drivers from society, the choices we make about our economic systems, what we value, and how we extract, the direct impacts of that extraction on the reefs, and then the benefits we get going back up through use and extraction and societal benefits that are shared amongst people. So I'll frame a little bit what I say about the health of coral reefs from this perspective. Now, the state of coral reefs is, I'm sure a lot of you are very well informed about that. The climate system as it affects reefs is very well understood. And this is the frustrating thing for coral reef scientists, because we've had this information in very good form for over 25 years. Of course, now the data is so much better than it was then, and we can go into much finer detail, but the principles haven't really changed. So global average temperature has been shooting up over the last few decades, and particularly 2023 and 2024 has shot up suddenly. The second graph up on the top over here, this, with the data processing we have now, this graph is being updated almost weekly, showing how, sometime, I think in April 2023, we suddenly started to break records as the northern summer was kicking off on land and in the sea around the world. And 2023 was just off the charts in terms of global temperatures. And this is sea surface temperature, but you can see the same in air temperatures. And then we came into 2024, and it's continued off the charts like that. And nobody knows what's happening here. Is it going to, we're in an El Nino, and El Nino is associated with higher temperatures. As the El Nino ends now, is that going to drop back down, and then we'll track back, probably not back to pre-2023, but will it go on with 2023 levels, or are we going to stay even higher up here somewhere? And we have no clue what's happening with this. We can't predict this because it's these sorts of, I guess, this may be a tipping point that our models don't deal with because they don't expressly model those. And then down here, this chart shows data that NOAA from the US updates almost on a daily basis every 2 or 3 years. And it's the sea surface temperatures interpreted for heat stress that affects corals, the number of weeks above, at least a degree above what they're used to that time of year. And we're way off the charts throughout the Western Indian Ocean. So we track this in my program, and we collate bleaching records from around the region. The Great Barrier Reef is bleaching a lot right now in various parts in the West Pacific as well. The Caribbean, so off the map there, but it bleached in the summer last year. So we're really coming up to the beginning of a new global bleaching event. So what is the status of reefs very quickly around the world? So this is we have a network called the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network that compiles information from around the world. We implement the Western Indian Ocean node, and we help aggregate data from contributors on the ground or in the water there. This was a status report that was produced in 2020. And really what it shows is that from the start of reliable records around multiple places in the world, percent coral cover was pretty much stable up till 1997 or so. Of course, there's very wide error bars on that because of the lack of data from many places. This was the first global bleaching event in 1997, 98, the big El Nino in those years. So we had a loss of coral cover globally. Then there was a recovery to 2009, back up to close to prior levels. Of course, some of the species composition will have changed. A lot of vulnerable individuals from species will have been lost, and more resistant species begin to take over in these conditions. And then from 2010 to 2019 or so, there was this long progressive decline. We estimated 14% loss of corals during that time. When you line that up with heat or high sea surface temperatures around the world, so there's the blue line still that I showed, and then the black line is the global sea surface temperature rise in the latitudes that you find coral reefs. And you can see that the loss of coral cover aligns quite well with where there are these very severe heat stress in these dark red lines, but also prolonged rises in global temperatures as well. From 2019, it was, or after 2017, it was actually relatively cool for quite a long time. And there was a prolonged La Nina for 3 years that ended last year. So temperatures didn't really kick up until last year in 2023, when we've had this big uptick in temperature. This is just a hand-drawn line. And now I've put a red bar here now because we are going to announce the 4th global mass bleaching event, I think on Monday, because all the indications are that's where we are. So there will be a big announcement on that. So don't say anything about it yet, but on Monday it'll be there. So the thing is, and then the question is this line of coral cover, we're starting a new global report. We don't yet know if since 2020 coral cover has been climbing back up again, or if it stayed more or less stable, or maybe it started to go down, and then what's going to be the downtick from this. So it is globally, it is a bad picture for corals, and I've already shown this graph before. So what can we do about this? Obviously, we can't do a lot about the temperature itself in the water unless we really make decisions on carbon dioxide emissions, and that needs to have been done, many years in the past to have an impact right now. But to get this information into decision-making circles, one of the indicators that's come through the Global Biodiversity Framework now, the new Conventional Biological Diversity Framework, is the Red List of Ecosystems from IUCN. So we've applied this to coral reefs in our region. And basically what that means is, we have a model of how the ecosystem functions. In this case, it's based on corals, fleshy algae, herbivores or parrotfish, and piscivores or predators, groupers. And like the Red List of Species, the Red List of Ecosystems has a very, quite a rigid framework, a well-established framework of 5 criteria that you can assess and then apply those to to estimate the risk of collapse of the ecosystem, as opposed to the risk of extinction. And from green to yellow and red, these are the familiar sort of categories and colors of the red listing process. So we did this with the data we have from our region. And I'll just provide an overview of the results. And we're hoping that having done this information can, one, help countries make decisions on investment in conservation or more information research, but also make policy decisions in global circles. So this summarizes just for corals and the groupers I'm showing here. So corals is the foundation of the ecosystem. So we found that surprisingly, there was a lot more green or reefs in least concern or good condition. That's the best condition category you can have. And then 2 ecoregions there up here, which were vulnerable, in which the corals were vulnerable. And these are either a very small ecoregion in the south down here, and this one is the outer Seychelles. So these are the remote islands in the Seychelles over here. And what seems to have happened there is that while there has been a lot of coral mortality from past bleaching events, which are documented, there has actually been recovery, but this has been now, it seems, of the weedier species and the species that are not so involved in reef building. And that what we found is that while the coral cover came back fairly well, when we looked at vulnerability because of climate change, it was future warming in these island ecoregions resulted in a much higher level of threat. So it sort of means that while corals have been able to, in this very simple indicators of coral cover, have been able to keep up with impact so far, anticipated warming in the future may be too much, is predicted to be too much for them to bear. And we're already getting into that this year, perhaps. So this is an important thing about, there's a lot of discussions about resistance of corals to high temperatures and so on. You can have them. Many may have survived what they've experienced to date, but that's not necessarily a sign of what they'll be able to survive in the future. And then in relation to fish, because fishing is widespread throughout the region, and so the top predators, which are the preferred target species for fisheries, almost all of the ecoregions, half of the sites in all the ecoregions came out as being severely depleted. The groupers were so low that they classified as, as critically endangered in terms of risk of collapse. And that was a factor in all of the mainland ecoregions. So on the mainland coast, the corals are in not such a bad shape, but the fish are in a really bad shape. But on the islands, the corals are really threatened by future warming because of the temperature dynamics in the islands. Now, the thing is, so over here, that's all very well having these really broad categories, but that's really one output we provide for some of the countries, and some of the ecoregions like here, Kenya, northern Tanzania, ecoregion crosses a national boundary. It's a bit hard for the countries to necessarily use that in decision making. And so now part of what we're doing with this is not just to produce the output of the red list of ecosystems, but to use that data in a much more granular level. So this is just for Kenya, so just the Kenyan coast. This is we were able to plot from 0. This is the sites in the best condition to the sites that reach the point of collapse. We plot all of the sites and color-coded as well for their degree of health. And then we can break the national data down into these counties or local government jurisdictions. You can also look at protected areas or areas of interest that you might have. So how can we use this information in a much more granular way to help local decision makers manage their reefs? So this could be local government, protected area agencies, or community fishery organizations who have authority over their areas. And we could do that for hard corals, for algae, for parrotfish, and for groupers. And you can see again, the groupers are much more depleted than parrotfish are over here. I mean, one of the perhaps, it may be a silver lining to this cloud is that while we know that corals are being lost in favor of algae overall, so there is going to be more and more algae on the reefs, which is not a good sign for the coral reefs, but algae do support herbivorous fish. And so in terms of resource use, if we can maintain reefs in good health in terms of water quality and make sure fisheries are not depleting the fish too much, while we may be losing out on the health of the coral reefs as a whole, we might be able to maintain fish production that supports communities and local economies and so on. And so that's, that's an important silver lining, though it's not ideal for what we may want. So it's a bleak future for coral reefs, and I'm never the fun person at dinner when we get into these conversations. So this first graph shows a paper up to 2018 showing just how much the interpreting temperature for corals, how significant this increase in thermal stress has been, and that's just to 2018. This is the IPCC projections to 2100. And the IPCC has used this 1.5 degree warming and then 2 degrees warming as critical thresholds. Well, we thought 1.5 degrees was far away, but we're right there just about now. And this is again a graph that is just interpreted in the last few days, showing how while here we are in February 2024, we've crossed the 1.5 degree warming limit this year, but it's actually that it's crossed over a long period of time, and this average increase is projected to cross around 2033 at this point in time. And they actually say it needs to cross that line for 20 years or over a 20-year window. So that's all very well for looking at long periods in the future, in the past, about when might this happen. But if we're trying to manage a crisis this year or next year, thinking we won't act until we have that 20-year average is probably not a very good thing. We have to work out how to be able to respond to these in real time. So the climate system, what's happening if I use this little cartoon here of the nature, economy, society interactions, we're really just mismanaging the indirect and the direct drivers of decline from climate. So the direct driver of decline is CO2 emissions, fossil fuel use. The indirect drivers of decline here are our value system, the economic system, our insistence on forever growth without reining that in and ensuring that there's no impacts on nature. So we're really, and in the coral reef world, what I've been reacting to is we're so focused on nature locally and protecting reefs where they are, but we haven't done enough, I think, to communicate out to broader societies. So in developed countries and those that really drive the market system around the planet. So that is, North America, Western Europe, and China, and Japan is really to say, look, these regions really have to rein in their model of growth because that's what's driving the decline. If we look at the fishery or production system on coral reefs, it's a much more complex problem. There's, huge local social, economic growth and poverty issues, power dynamics and corruption and so on, that we're not managing well still in tropical coastlines, and we have a lot of work to do on those relationships. So just one brief slide on locally managed marine areas, realizing the limitations of what countries can do in terms of managing long coastlines where infrastructure is very poor, transport is very poor. It's very hard for national fisheries management to work, and most coral reef countries and tropical countries are really recognizing the need to empower local or sort of community governance in terms of managing resources. And also, finally, after many years, recognizing that historically a lot of communities and indigenous peoples were already managing their fisheries and what they were doing for many years and decades and centuries perhaps. Modern systems of governance came in and sat on top of those and oppressed them in many ways, and now realizing that we need to sort of re-empower this system and make sure people can have agency. Because if you can manage nature where you are, you're more dependent on it, you will likely look after it better. And then the issue here with community management areas and trying to address this ambition to increase area under effective management is, how big should these areas be? How close do they need to be? How much of a marine system really needs to be under high levels of protection and areas under sustainable use? And where's the gradient between these two things? They're not necessarily completely separate from each other. So a lot of different questions there. So that yeah. Okay. All right. Might have to go to. I have to try and move the.
You move the cursor off this side.
There we go. All right. Okay. So after that brief pause, so one of the groups I've been working with over the last 3 years is the Earth Commission. And this is so co-chaired by, well, there were 3 co-chairs, but really Johan Rockström was one, so focus on planetary boundaries. The other co-chair was Jayita Gupta, who's a justice scholar. And what was really interesting to me there was the possibility of thinking about how we're reaching planetary limits, which with coral reefs we clearly are, but what that means locally. And in terms of, we use this concept of the Earth system boundaries as a slightly different framing for planetary boundaries. And there were 5 of them listed over there. And I was really focused on biodiversity as the one of interest to me. But they're not, and then there are 2 boundaries within the biosphere boundaries, or biodiversity boundaries for us to look at. One is focused on intact ecosystems, and this is partly focused around, carbon sequestration and global benefits we get from nature being intact, minimizing risk of loss of species and extinction. But the other one is really focused on provisioning for people. So how does nature support people? And that's through ecosystem services, nature's contributions to people, as we call them in IPBES. And that's really expressed by looking at the function of ecosystems and their ability to support the extraction and the uses, so the benefits that we take or that we utilize in one way or another. And to me, this is really interesting because this comes down to landscape and seascape level and the area of agency of individual people. A lot of it is around, the many different types of services. And the key thing then is this justice angle, because once you start addressing nature that is accessible to people, you can address aspects of justice about their ability to get it. Is it healthy enough? Is it accessible to them? And does it provide what they need? So we have this framing of safe and just, and for these services, the safety really means, is there enough of that particular service or function? The justice is related to access, as I said. And then we looked at this boundary at the scale of 1 kilometre around the planet, because that's, many of the provisioning services that support people. We assessed 5 in this review paper. A lot of these accrue at very short distances anyway. So if the nature is too far away, many pollinators only fly a few hundred meters, or if you have vegetation for erosion control, it only works where the vegetation is, not at a distance away. And looking at that in a square kilometer, what these violin plots quantify is the proportion of a square kilometer that is under the type of vegetation or habitat that provides that function. So for pollination, it could be, flower beds or hedgerows and things like that. It doesn't have to be intact native vegetation. It could be quite altered, but it has to have the functions that are needed from it. So it is very sort of anthropomorphic, focused on our needs, but that's very important to many people, and particularly to people who have to depend on nature for their livelihoods. And looking across all of them, of course, it varies quite a lot, but this band of 20 to 25% per square kilometer came out as sort of as a common boundary, and it's also been shown in other literature as well. I have an interest if this works in shallow marine systems for coral reefs, so we didn't assess that yet, but hopefully in the next round we'll get into that. The other thing that was happening at the same time as we were looking into that was with the negotiations at the Convention on Biological Diversity on the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this should have been done by 2020, but it was delayed to 2022 because of COVID. Was from an African perspective as well, with a group of authors, we really wanted to contest the narrative that was very strong around protection of biodiversity in the best biodiversity areas. You know, there's a very focus on protected areas and species and optimization and focusing on, you know, the places that are most intact, where usually there's not many people, or if there are people, perhaps, you know, they're not impacting the nature very much. And that's also, a lot of that is in the lands or the territories of indigenous peoples. And so we had this idea from the 17% targets as they were for the 80 targets due in 2020, which was reached in terms of the area legally protected or designated as protected, not necessarily with management on the ground, to ramp up the ambition to 30%. And if you just added more area, you know, an additional 13% in the same spaces. So this on the x-axis, it shows the condition of nature in a national territory from intact on the left at 0 to the 100th percentile as in urban areas and farmland and so on up here. If you just add that additional protection in the same spaces, you just magnify the same social problems that we had with the current model. And the idea was that, can we really set up a system that will push this new effort in protection across all spaces here? So you actually very focused on conserving and protecting nature and making sure it's in good health where people are living, not to hide it away from them, but so they benefit from it. And if you can do that and invest in nature conservation and protection like that, then you'll amplify people's commitment, you know, and desire to have conservation where they live. So it's not seen as a threat, but a support to their lives. And then finally, in cities in the most impacted areas, this smaller amount here gets us up to the 30% that's wanted for 2030, but now there's a lot of guidance that it should be more than that and can be more than that as well, but for very different functions people might benefit from in cities. So then the value of this approach is there are many values, I think, or we're proposing in doing this. One is getting away from this sort of national and global prioritization approaches, which is very hard to address people's needs in those approaches. If you focus at the local scale, you can focus on people there and they can represent themselves, and you address equity much better. And you can also apply local knowledge, and you can integrate that with scientific knowledge as well, much more effectively in a specific context, rather than trying to do it much more generally at larger scales. And then also at those local levels, you address all the other targets you need to address as well, not just the area under protection, which is what is shown here, but you can address sustainable use. There's different targets under the biodiversity framework. You can address restoration needs as well. And likely, as you go up into these areas that are more degraded, a larger part of this proportion would need restoration actions as well to improve the biodiversity. So one, you get more function from it. And then over time, it may get to a level at which you can count it for biodiversity targets also, in terms of the, you know, getting to certain levels of biodiversity that you'd like. But then not only the conservation targets, but food production, health, you could address other sustainable development goals as well, mixing them in with your conservation targets to see how you're addressing all of these issues within a local space. So then the idea would be that if you have, for example, within a national territory, you have these locations, one over here and one over here. So one will have much better biodiversity, state of nature than this one. So how you would meet the various targets would be quite different in these two areas. But you can deal with that in the local context. You can really identify the jurisdiction and governance. You can address local values, priorities, and livelihoods. You can work out how each local area will contribute to the national contribution to the global targets. And through that cascade, you can also access international support to countries, and then how that gets divided up within a country. So that's critical. And I think the last thing that I think is really important, and this one down here, is this issue of finance. And how do you get finance and support into nature and conservation at local levels? And I think in spaces where people live, so you anchor in the local jurisdiction. So is it community lands or territories, or is it private farmland or something like that. But if there is support that's needed to sustain that nature and or to restore it, you can link finance from somewhere to that specific parcel of nature, and it's secured in that local jurisdiction, and you make it so that that natural capital is secured under the local jurisdiction. And you link from the financial capital, which has been taken out of nature at some point in time and accumulated somewhere far away, you bring it back into natural capital. And we have the computational ability to do that. We can identify every parcel of land around the planet at very high resolutions. And you can link these things together. I think it just takes the right financial and sort of spatial analysts and so on, and the biodiversity and the economists, and of course, local governments and to come together to work out how to do this. But then what about the global level? That's all very well for trying to improve things locally, but we have not yet started to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. This is a curve from the paper in 2016 led by Georgina Mace that some of you may have participated in and may have studied as well. Where are we going? So we're somewhere along here. Extrapolated trends, 2030 is where we're coming to up ahead. The big drivers of decline globally are still increasing. These are the graphs of the great acceleration from Will Stephen's work in 2015. And a lot of these major sectors are not capping off yet. This is the CO2 rise with the stripes, nicely marked up with all of the climate COPs that just seem to track the curve going up. So, you know, we're not getting there yet. This is where it's really important to be very clear about pointing where action is needed, because it's not everybody around the world that is producing that carbon dioxide. It's some people. And this is a figure from the Climate Inequality Report from early last year, 2023. You can do this based on carbon dioxide. You could do it based on income flows or on commodities, you know, all sorts of different metrics, all point in the similar directions, is that those with the highest income brackets produce the most carbon dioxide. So that's the green bar, the contribution from the bottom 50%, middle 40, and top 10%. If you split that up amongst the deciles of population, you can see the contribution of that top 10%, 50% of carbon emissions globally, is much more than any of these other sectors. These gray bars show, if it was equitable, the amount of carbon dioxide produced by every person, independently of their income level. This is what it would be. So this middle 40% is about where, not that we should have produced all this carbon dioxide, but if we had equitably done it, that's how it would be. If you combine that from the vulnerability to the impact from that carbon emission, so divide the red bars by the green bars, you see that and then scale it to 1 for the top 10%. The bottom 50% have 150 times greater sort of impact per carbon emission, per carbon dioxide emitted than the top 10%. So there's great inequalities there that we have to address. And this rule of thumb is emerging in various places. And I think it gives us a very good sort of overall guide. Of course, there's a lot of details that would have to be worked out. If, you know, the solutions would be perhaps to live like the middle 40%, that's in the middle there where we should aim. We need to raise welfare in the bottom 50%, and that means greater income, and usually that will mean greater impacts to nature, to the planet from the bottom 50%. But you enable this by reducing emissions, and you redistribute from the top 10%. And there's plenty of space to do both of those things. There's a lot of literature coming out now that's supporting this. This is work by Jason Hickel, which really shows, in this case, so cumulative excess resource use by higher income and upper middle income countries and lower middle income, and then low income countries don't even figure on this graph. This represents the amount of nature that is transferred from low income countries or from countries up into these upper income brackets. And the big point here is that this net flow of resources to high income countries is 80 times greater than the overseas development assistance that they provide to those low income countries. So overseas aid comes nowhere close to the amount of extraction that is happening. And that differential is a measure of the inequity and what is driving the decline of nature in low-income places. This is a paper from the Earth Commission group as well, showing that. So I've shown just two of the graphs here. This top one is the total residual energy consumption, and the bottom one is produced capital. So these are sort of measures of energy and total manufactured capital. The overall message from this paper is, if you look at, 30 to 62% of global population, so that's this box over here on the left, consume less than just minimum access level. So in this, we calculated if there's a minimum level, and there were two levels in the paper that were identified, minimum poverty, basically. So the UN has the, I don't know, $1.90 or $2 per day, but this is more of a metric of actual material use. So 30 to 60% are below that level globally. To be just, we should increase their consumption to above that minimum level. That would add less than 1% to the global footprint for most commodities or most sectors, apart from energy. From energy, it rises by 20% for carbon dioxide emissions. So, there's this big fear of, global population. If we were to provide minimum access to everybody around the planet, would that, blow us way even further above the boundaries that we now have? But it wouldn't, not by much for most things, but it would for carbon dioxide. But the other important point is down here, that this is equivalent to the consumption levels of the top 1 to 4% of consumers. And this bar here is 4%, and 1%, of course, would be just a single line over there. So there's plenty of space to redistribute from the top ends here, whether it's the top 10% or 1% or 0.01%. We can deal with the needs of the bottom of the pyramid by redistribution and figuring out what better to do at the top end, as well as, of course, doing all of this with much better and more sustainable technologies and approaches that are possible now. I'll just skip through this because I've already mentioned the Global Biodiversity Framework. But the main thing here is that a lot of actions and ambition have been identified in 2020 for the things that we should do. But the problem is that applying this Earth system justice perspective really highlights the inequities in the types of actions that are really being proposed. So a lot of actions for conservation, protected areas, the best biodiversity places are generally in low-income countries around the world that have had less degradation so far. High-income countries have already degraded their nature a long time ago, so we're sucking it in from other places. So they made the least contribution to global biodiversity loss. The resources have already been appropriated by the wealthier nations, both in the past, but also into the future with contracts that are established that last for a long time. Then their territories are prioritized for biodiversity actions that do have real opportunity costs locally. And the return of flow of capital, of finance is insufficient, is way below the amount that is being extracted. This is true in commercial context, and it's also true in conservation, where there are strong disadvantages. Now, to bend the curves of biodiversity loss, we also need to bend the drivers. And this was some modeling that was done, that came out in 2020, which really showed that, so this bottom curve over here is the business as usual curve. So from 2010 was when they had data. The continued decline in nature would level off. Just investing in all the right conservation and restoration that we're calling for would level it out much earlier, but it wouldn't get back to prior levels, and it wouldn't reverse the decline that has been experienced. It's only by adding all the right actions on production and conservation and consumption, so all the economic drivers, if you address all of those, you can get to a better future than where they started in 2010. And it would go till about 2070 or so before you get back to the same spot. So this is really indicating that we need to, this is the transformations that are needed, and in IPBES assessments, we talk about that a lot. Now, so in addition to the direct biodiversity actions, we need this priority attention to the direct and indirect drivers of decline to get from this point up to this point. But the other thing that's really important, and this is where I think we need to do a lot in the research in the conservation world, is to be a lot more honest about what's possible in terms of conservation and restoration. So this red curve is the nature positive curve. I showed it a few slides back. showing to motivate countries to and actors to invest in nature positive actions, which we need to do, but with the implication of such a high level and such a rapid rate of recovery that it's just not possible. It's not physically possible. And when you're convincing, especially poor countries and communities, to give up something in order to get something back, you have to be honest about how long it's going to take to get there for them and for you to support them in order to get there, rather than setting up these sort of dreams that are, you know, in many ways the right dreams we should have. But if you continually fail to reach those aspirations in the future, you just undermine commitments to progress. And then in doing this, the Earth Systems Justice really focuses on 3 levels of justice that are really important. So interspecies justice, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. And I think just expressing these in very tangible ways for sort of biodiversity science and conservation in a critique for the Global Biodiversity Framework that we did as the Earth Commission. We identified 3 critical things to do. One is to raise welfare, and that bottom 50% is essential. We can't not do that in the world. We have to make that a priority. Otherwise, why would poorer countries get involved? We have to foster equity, and that means minimizing the gap. And that means eliminating overconsumption and excesses that are driving the decline, but also that bring down this top tier that are increasingly distant from the bottom tier. And justice is really the focus that will enable this to happen. And if we don't have that as a priority, we won't be able to really do the actions that are necessary. So just finalizing that, my last slide, then applying these or thinking about how to address sustainability challenges. So I think first is, I think using models like the Sustainable Development Goals, but in a very general way, in a very localized and sort of in a way that people can bend to their interests and interpret in the ways that they need, is very important. In understanding critically that that all the physical parts of our economy, use and extraction, come from nature. And that's what supports our societal well-being. And we have to manage these interactions, the indirect and the direct drivers. We need to extract less. We need to transform our value system. Otherwise, this won't really change. We need to extract less here, and we need to share much better what we're extracting from nature. So that's point 1. We need to understand this nature economy society dynamic and value nature as a primary critical asset. And then those other 2 things, the direct and indirect drivers, are sort of right-hand side issues, and the justice things are left-hand side issues in these relationships. And I think that's my last one. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We'll open up to questions from anyone. I'll just kick off. Going back to your coral reef work, if I answered correctly, there have been these multiple bleaching events. The reef as a whole has been more resilient than was anticipated in terms of bouncing back from those, even though there's a turnover in community. Is that correct?
Yeah, so reefs and corals have adapted to higher temperatures, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. I mean, it's evolutionary as natural selection happens. So I have been a bit surprised, actually, that in the West Indian Ocean, I've seen this most clearly on Mayotte Island, actually, it's one of the Comorian islands, is that it's had 4 major bleaching events, so one earlier in the early 80s and until 2015. And each time the major corals came back. But one, there are some vulnerable species that are less and less common. And 2, we don't know when it's going to get kicked over the edge. Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, likely corals are showing that the conditions that they experienced in '98, when we see those conditions, which we're seeing quite frequently, they're not as vulnerable to that anymore. They are persisting through that. So there's definitely some adaptation happening, but we don't know its limits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my follow-up question to some extent. Given this adaptation, how confident are you in these projections of quite severe declines with?
Oh, I'm very confident in the declines, because the thing is, so in our region, we have 350 species of corals, perhaps. And for example, in the Persian Gulf and further north, it's a very high temperature environment, but there's about 10 to 20 species there that persist, and they don't build reefs the same way that corals do in better conditions, but they survive those conditions. So we may end up with corals that are very much like the Persian Gulf corals, but they won't build up the same reefs anymore, and it'll be 20 species rather than 300.
Yeah. Great. Okay, we can open up to questions. Okay, Steve, I'll pass you this. Okay. It's just for the online audience.
Yes. So reducing the consumption by the richest economies, how do we do that?
Sorry?
So reducing consumption by the richest economies, what's the next step? How do we do that?
Well, I think there's a huge amount on that. We use much more energy and waste a lot of energy in developed economies that isn't necessarily necessary. Build bigger buildings and bigger houses. I think there's an immense amount of food waste and growing the wrong kinds of food, so high dependence on red meat and so on. So there's a lot of options, and there's a lot of examples from around the world of much less of ways of living that consume much less.
Perhaps I should have said,
yeah.
How do we encourage?
Or how do we encourage? I think it's people realizing so a couple of things there. One is that you can do a lot personally about things, and two, that while individual action is very good, we need system change, and you need to join together to get the systems to change. That means getting governments to make regulations, so companies have to act in certain ways or to incentivize certain actions more than others. I can understand, and there's a lot of misinformation as well, a lot of things undermining the ability of people to act, but realizing that you can, and realizing that while it's a mistake to think we're about to fall off a cliff, next year at 1.5 degrees or at 2 degrees, but we always have a point. We can always have a choice to make things better. So at every day or every decision, you can lead to a better future outcome than another decision. And of course, the more everybody does that, and the bigger those decisions are, the better will be that future. So I think that's what has got me into following through with this, because the message from coral reefs is terrible. But I think a decision recognizing that we will still have reefs in the future off the Kenyan coast. They'll have a lot less coral, but they might be very healthy algal reefs producing a lot of fish, and tourists in 35 years will still want to go diving on them. So you can still have the tourist economies and so on. But it'll be better than if we just let them become degraded, slimy, polluted ecosystems, that if we just give up, that's what they would become. Yeah.
So thanks, really thought-provoking. A lot of the model and a lot of the approach you're talking about here is about governments coming together to work out how to solve this. But if you look at the global stage right now, I don't have much confidence in governments being able to do that. And I think that to me, and when I look at the UK government, even the 30 by 30, the chances of us reaching that are pretty slim.
Yeah.
Where I do see change going, and I don't see in this framing, I think there's a really big shift in businesses right now. And I think in some ways, the businesses having to suddenly realize that they have dependencies on nature as well as risks, and things like the frameworks like the TNFD and the CSRD, I think they're shifting the dial much quicker and in a more positive way than I ever imagined. And I just wondered where businesses and their sort of use and extraction fits into your model.
Yeah. So thanks. And I realized I didn't really talk about that part at all. So I agree entirely. I think governments certainly have a space because they create the space and the legislation and so on. But mostly happens outside of the hands of government itself. So businesses are critically important. So businesses realizing that one, they can, of course, it costs somewhat to invest in sustainability, but there are benefits from doing that, especially if legislation comes in that requires you to disclose, like the TNFD will hopefully lead to. But a lot of the focus, so the nexus assessment that I showed at the beginning on actors in food, water, health sectors as well, a lot of those recommendations will be targeting different types of actors, so businesses as well, companies, local governments and cities who can take action themselves to reduce impacts, realize they can.
But I think you also said, if I might, I mean, it's making those frameworks mandatory.
Yeah.
So CSRD is now mandatory, and it has absolutely transformed the way that people are working. Businesses in Europe suddenly are all interested in nature. So I think there is hope there, rather than feeling that actually we're never ever going to get here. But I do think that businesses are going to be a really important part of this.
Yes, and the other part of it is that, you know, incorporating, so internalizing the externalities, realizing that so I've presented nature decline as an indication of wealth that has been extracted from nature into financial capital, and we need to bring that back. But also is that, so to avoid that in real time, if you make sure you're not degrading nature, so that will reduce your profit margin at the end, but you're spending money on the right things along the pathway, and that needs to be incentivized to be able to do that as well. So a lot of the finance should come from businesses and the markets rather than into governments and then out, you know, through aid and things like that.
So I have a follow-up question on that. So I work in business consulting around TNFD and CSRD. And one of the limitations we see is that what you have to disclose is your operations, and most of your impact is much further down your supply chain. So then how can we start with the kind of opening of the door that CSRD and TNFD have to actually start moving this out into something that's meaningful further than just one's operations?
Okay, I know what TNFD is, but CSRD is, because I don't work in Europe, so I don't know.
Well, it's similar. Yeah. So nature disclosing in business.
Yes.
How do we make it go further than it currently is? So then you can't then kind of hide what actually is the impact within the supply chain.
So one of the next steps in that supply chain is, of course, understanding. So that's called the scope 1 and 2, and then scope 3 is beyond the immediate company to the suppliers, and you know, the whole value chain of a product from where it's extracted to where it's sold and then disposed as well. So as part of the Earth Commission, is part of a group called the Global Commons Alliance, and they're the SBTN, Science-Based Targets Network, is trying to develop more of the metrics where businesses can work out what the impact is of their value chain, and then you know, and of course it'll take legislation and to really give it power all the way to the end to make sure that all your suppliers are sustainable as well and minimizing their impacts and so on. But yes, you're right; those are just the beginning. You need to actually have the action that shows the delivery. And the other thing there, I think, is, and what we've been talking about in our workshop now, is having not just financial value as the end all be all of companies and value in stock markets and so on, that you can show value from investing in nature and social welfare and benefits as well. So it's not all just money.
I was just wondering if you had a view on the UK's seeming intention to meet its 30 by 30 targets by just drawing big rings around its overseas territories, which doesn't seem very just at all.
Well, it's very easy to do that, to draw the ring around overseas territories where you don't have much. There aren't, well, of course, there are people in the overseas territories, but the economy doesn't tend to go out all the way to the end of the 200 nautical miles quite so much. But yes, it needs to happen. So I think all the countries that have a lot of overseas territories, we need to see action in their continental waters as well. To make it also makes it representative, because you're not necessarily addressing all of the marine systems and issues if you just do it in the overseas territories. But yeah, that's the easy win, and that's what's happened in, you know, all sorts of other sort of conservation areas as well, is to do it where there's less people out there. You can draw up big areas. The challenge comes to where you're dealing with lots of people who are highly dependent on the nature that they're living in, and of course, you know, and everybody has rights. We need to address those much better now than we have been doing in the past. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So you spoke about the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and so I was just curious to get your opinion on now that the GBF is in place. What would you say the priorities are for international biodiversity negotiations, international biodiversity policy going forward, but before 2030. What do you see kind of, in the next COPs as being the major priorities or big gaps that should still be filled at that policy stage? Because of course, implementation is the most important thing right now, but are there still kind of gaps in the policy that we should be focusing on as well?
Yeah, so I think the Global Biodiversity Framework, I mean, it's quite comprehensive. It has these 23 targets, and they go all the way from very, focused species and protection actions all the way through to changing economics and companies, disclosing their impacts and things like that. And then equity as well at the end. What I found was the biggest lack, and that we were commenting on in that last paper that I mentioned, was this singular focus on 30 by 30. I hate the term 30 by 30. It's target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Convention. It's one of 23 targets, and they all need to be implemented together. And I think that integration is what's critical. And I think a couple of things are really important for that. One is the area-based target. So really understanding how the first target, spatial planning, restoration, protection areas, and production areas, so target 10, fit together, and how you really deal with those in spatial planning on land and on the sea. If you do that well, you get to 100%, planned areas, and then you need to work out how to reduce impacts across those. I think others, of course, the equity issues of sustainable use and the agency and rights of local communities and indigenous peoples, and there's a couple of targets around those. And then the last ones I think are really critical. So the 14 and 15 are on production and consumption, and then the ending harmful subsidies and making sure finance is coming. I think those are so I think more in these sort of buckets of targets rather than individual ones. And then connecting all of these to the other frameworks, the GBF doesn't exist in isolation. It's got to interact with the Climate Convention, and then also with the SDGs, and trade is sort of the big one, I think.
Thank you, David, for your talk, and congratulations on your election to be chair of IPBES for the next 3 years or so. That's actually what my question was going to be about. Is what do you hope to achieve in your term as chair of IPBES, perhaps that IPBES hasn't achieved before? What do you hope to do differently, or do that hasn't been done yet?
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so it was a surprise that I came to this. I thought I would never have thought of it myself, and then when first suggested, no way, I'm a scientist. But then I realized that there's a chance to really engage in the dialogue. So there are a couple of important ones that I would really like to do. One is so I think IPBES has done incredibly well at building up its credibility. As a new chair, when I go into new spaces, I hear about that all the time, that the way IPBES has developed its processes makes the science and its interaction with policy incredibly credible and relevant, and that's recognized. So to maintain and increase that. Second one is the relationship with IPCC. So there's being intergovernmental institutions, they both have very fixed procedures and processes about how they operate, and those are barriers to integration. And then, so it takes a lot of work to sort of try and work out how we can get over those barriers and do some productive work. And I think there's areas in which that can happen more and more now, in the sense from both sides that we actually have to do that. We can't work in isolation. And then the other is a little bit what I'm doing over here, is that the science that comes out of IPBES assessments is very, the science is very complex, and combining these knowledge systems together, it's very much integrated with indigenous knowledges as well. And it comes out in these summaries for policymakers that become very turgid because they're negotiated with governments. And so just talking about what that means in much more informal language and settings, and bringing in my background as a scientist, having worked, on the ground in tropical coastal communities, to interpret what does that mean in much more direct language, and also interpreting it not just for countries, which is what the assessment, the summaries for policymakers are written for countries, but what does that mean for actors, for businesses and others and so on. And we'll actually put out a few more outputs related to those after the assessments are done. So trying to work that out. I have 3 years. I've got, it's taken me about 6 months to see the lay of the land, so about 2.5 more years, and to see what I can do with it. And I think my measure of success will be the degree to which I'm told internally that I'm going too far in doing certain things. So I have to sort of step back a bit, without falling over the edge, and see how far we can push out on these boundaries.
As well as the big assessments, there seem to be a number of more targeted assessments that IPBES does. What's on the horizon?
Yeah, so the classical assessments are that we do these 4-year assessments. And so there are 2 going right now on Nexus assessment I mentioned, 1 on transformative change. We've realized that these, it's hard to respond to immediate issues when it takes not just 4 years to do an assessment, but 2 or 3 years to get to the point of starting. So we now do fast track assessments, which only take 2 years. And we have 2 of those that are requested by the CBD to support the Global Biodiversity Framework. So one is on monitoring biodiversity, and that's starting right now with selecting authors. And then we have another one on spatial planning, which is for both the CBD and also the conventional migratory species, because we don't only supply the CBD. We have a second global assessment that's just starting up, and that'll come out in 2028. And then we have 1 more short assessment to do in 2029. And we're sort of trying to work out what the topic could be for that to fill an urgent gap. So we get suggestions from countries and from the CBD on that. So if you have ideas for that, can talk about it, but then you need to feed it to your country representative so it comes up through the countries. Yeah. Actually, sorry, if I can just say one more thing before you do this other smaller work that we do. There's a lot of ongoing work through a number of task forces that sort of continues through the years and supports the assessments as they do their work. So one on scenarios and models, another one on indigenous and local knowledge, others on data management and so on. So that work really integrates a lot from the sciences and also with other groups like IPCC. We're trying to do that for modeling especially. Sorry.
I was just wondering if you see any limitations in the attempts to unlock private finance based on the narrative that we have to do it because it's something beneficial and helpful for the businesses themselves or the humanity. Or do you think it's sort of well, 1, it is necessary, and 2, do you think it's kind of a transitional step to initiate a transformation from our worldview from nature for society to nature for nature, or nature for as culture, kind of in the nature future framework?
So yeah, so IPBES has a big piece of work on. We had an assessment that came out a 1.5 years ago on values, the values assessments, and that really, I think one of the main findings there that I think was really helpful is saying, our market systems are really dominated by one worldview. That's how decisions are being made when it comes down to economy and money, really. And just by considering multiple worldviews, we can make more balanced and better decisions. So just recognizing plurality is very important. And of course, hopefully then being inclusive to make sure decisions include that plurality as well needs to happen. The Nature Futures Framework is one where we're trying to more explicitly identify different worldviews around nature and how we can understand those. Laura here is an architect of that, so you can ask her for a lot more specific information on that. And so I think, personally, I think we need to get businesses to realize that they need to value things more broadly in making decisions, and that can count in their integrated reporting or something like that. So it's sort of an incremental step, I think, in making better decisions now. But 2, I think really to get into this sort of sustainable future, we do need to get into some value change. And how that will happen, I have no idea, but we need to push for it very hard.
We have an online question from Talitha. Do you think there is still value to ambitious terms like nature positive as a guiding star for the direction we'd like to be moving in? Or do you think the challenge of achieving it undermines its usefulness?
Yeah, so the debate around nature positive as a slogan, it's very hard. We're trying to look for these very simple slogans to express what we need to do. We need to get into a more positive place for nature, that's for sure. And companies and our business sectors, countries need to stop being nature negative and become nature positive. But we have to show that they are actually being positive for nature, that the outcome for nature is positive rather than just doing one little thing and then stopping, doing more before you actually demonstrate that there has been an outcome for that. And there's a big worry about sort of misusing the label nature positive and making it too easy to sort of do little things, but not really changing enough to have an outcome in the future. So I think it's really important. I think what's under the hood of nature positive is what's more important, is that you really show the investment in making it possible. So I've never been a fan of any of the slogans that have come up, because they really need to be, I guess, demonstrated with action. And be very inclusive about what is being done, where, and showing how that's being done. Yeah.
It seems well, I was about to wrap up, but there seem to be two enthusiastic hands down here. So we'll go for those.
I will say, actually, as the microphone is going, that on businesses as well, Lara reminded me, we're also producing the business and biodiversity assessment, which will come out at the end of next year, which will have a lot more tangible actions for businesses too. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenges that you face in the kind of science and policy interface, specifically in terms of bringing other types of knowledge to the conversation. Because I think even if there's a big gap between academia and policy, there's also a really big gap between local knowledge and communities and policy.
Yes, and I mean, I'm from Kenya, so I'll say it directly. A lot of the challenges that local communities face are because of the national policies as well, and national government actions. So trying to bridge that gap is very hard. I think it's in all of these spaces. I think it's really important, and this is something that science has had a challenge with in the past, is there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of variation. And a lot of time when scientists are asked for simple guidance, we kind of say, well, it depends. And, there's caveats and this and that and the other. And while I think we need to be much more sort of determined in pushing for progress, we also always need to be very honest about uncertainty and that it's complicated. And as I said, for the values assessment, perhaps then the greatest value is making sure that the right people are in the room for discussing the challenges. Even if there's no simple solution, at least people, hear the challenges more honestly. So you bridge the gap by having representation, trying to make sure that you can actually honestly move forward with carrying forward from that. So, I mean, I haven't been in this space very long to see how that actually works in principle. But I know that it does make a big difference. So one of the practices that IPBES has, so it's in assessments, it's in our task forces, it's in our representation in our governing bodies. We have a bureau and things like that, that there is representation of regions, of genders, and then also now increasingly of indigenous peoples and communities from different parts, so that people are in that space to say, hey, well, this is an issue, for our people. But of course, it's very difficult at a very aggregated level, especially internationally, when you have a indigenous person from this region is very different from another indigenous group as well. And so, but I think it's making the space is very important. I think IPBES is doing that increasingly well.
Yeah, you said you don't like the 30 by 30 idea, and you don't like slogans, but I work in marketing, and that's I don't particularly like them either, but that's what resonates with people. Yeah. So I was wondering if there's something that resonates with you, and actually two questions, I guess. What's the thing that resonates with people that you're happy about it resonating?
Yeah, tough question. Thank you. So at the time of Nature Positive, I was sort of saying we should have nature people positive or nature positive people positive. What I'm saying now with these models that I was presenting here is nature where people live. It's not sexy and short, and you could probably think of a much better way to say it, but at least it describes what the aim is. And I think that's also part of the point, is that in coming to something, let's not jump too quickly to the end point, to what is a slogan, but let's have a strong description of what the thing is. And then through many different discussions, somebody will say the right words and you go, oh yeah, of course, that's the right thing. So it'll come. So.
It was quite snappy, actually. So.
Yeah. Right.
Sounds a great point to end on. So please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And as usual, we have drinks around the corner in the atmosphere room. So just go out and turn left, and you'll hear the noise, the clink of glasses. Chance to influence.